E ngā waka o te matu, tēnā koutou. E koro mā, e kui mā, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou I roto I ngā mihi ki Kingi Tuhetia. Nō reira, e te whakaminenga, nau mai, whakatau mai, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Neil Quigley. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural professorial lecture. The inaugural lecture series is an opportunity for us to showcase the work of our newly appointed professors in the university. Tonight, we're acknowledging Priya Kurian's promotion to Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Priya has been with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences since 1996, teaching global environmental politics, media and politics, gender, justice and the environment, and public policy. She's also the Deputy Chair of the School of Social Sciences. Priya is trained as a political scientist specializing in public policy, comparative politics, and women's studies. Her research is interdisciplinary and involves work on environmental, social, and cultural sustainability through a focus on three overlapping fields of study: environmental politics and policy, development studies, and science and technology studies. Priya has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Madras, and in the late 1980s worked as a journalist for the Times of India in Mumbai. From Mumbai, she went to the US and completed her master's and PhD degrees at Purdue University in Indiana. Priya has published over 95 research publications, including over 45 journal articles and book chapters, and 4 books. Her first book, International Organizations and Environmental Policy, won the Aaron Wildalski Award from the Policy Studies Organization USA for the best book in the field of public policy in 1997. Her 2003 book, Feminist Futures: Reimagining Women, Culture and Development, resulted in paradigm-shifting work in the field of gender and development. Her current research is in the area of sustainability, citizenship, and the governance of new and emerging technologies. In 2010, Professor Kurian and Professor Debasish Munshi from Waikato Management School were awarded a Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden Grant for a study on sustainable citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Professor Priya Kurian to give her inaugural professorial lecture.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Munar me tōpiri ngā maunga, ko Narmada Minatil me Waikato ngā awa, ko Priya ahau, tihei Maori ora. Greetings, Vice-Chancellor Neil Quigley, Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor Alistair Jones, Dean Robert Hanna, colleagues, students, friends, and family. I dedicate this lecture to my late mother, who's the most enduring source of inspiration in my life. Thank you to all of you for coming today to mark an important moment in my academic life. Thank you also to the many, many friends and colleagues who have written in to say that they can't be here today. Life in the academy, whether it's teaching, research, supervision, or service, is in every sense a shared collaborative project. And I want to take a moment to thank some of the people who have been on this journey with me. I want to thank my colleague and my very, very best friend, Debasish Munshi, for an inspirational and exhilarating partnership in life and work. I would not be here today but for his love and support. I thank my daughters, Akanksha and Alia, from whom I learn every day about new ways of thinking about the world, and whose very presence makes things possible. I thank also my parents, my brother, my whānau, people from Maliyekal, Manappuram, and the Munchis for their love. I thank my teachers who have taught and nurtured me. My greatest intellectual debt is to Professor Robert V. Bartlett, scholar, mentor, and friend. I also want to acknowledge the many current and past colleagues in political science and public policy and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Waikato and across campus, whose support and collegiality have made Waikato such a great place to work. But I'd like to thank in particular, first, Dr. Peter Gibbons, whose wisdom guided my early days as an associate dean in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Emeritus Professor Dick Bedford, who, as Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research in those days, was always willing to read and reread Marston Grant proposals. Dr. Patrick Barrett, for being a wonderful co-supervisor, co-researcher, and now a brilliant chair of the School of Social Sciences. Professor David McKee, who manages to find me a thriller to read just when the pressures of work get overwhelming. Professors Robin Longhurst, Linda Johnston, and Rachel Simon Kumar, feminist allies and friends. Associate Professors Sandy Morrison and Hine Timoana Greensill for their support. The inspiring members of the Environmental Sustainability Committee of the university for all of the work that we do together. And my many students and research collaborators, both here in New Zealand and around the world. Equally importantly, I thank the close circle of friends who have shared in the joys and sorrows that life offers, and whose support has been an integral part of my life. I know I've missed many in this rather shortened list, although you might have thought it rather long, but if you are here, you know who you are. So thank you again for all coming out tonight. Let me begin with a short story. It was a sweltering, hot, sunny afternoon in 1988. I was in the Indian state of Gujarat, close to Kevadia colony, the site where one of the largest dams in the world was going to be built. The crowds were gathering, villagers, tribal peoples or Adivasis, as we say, a few police scattered here and there, and a handful of activists. It was a fairly small rally, at least by Indian standards, about 500 people or so, although the numbers are kind of blurred after 27 years. A petite woman began to address the crowd. She spoke about large dams being planned on the river Narmada, the displacement of people that would take place, the submergence of forests and land that belonged by right to the Adivasi peoples, and the lack of any compensation from the state. It was a powerful speech and one that had a huge impact on me. The speaker was Medha Patkar, a charismatic and brilliant activist who would go on to lead the Narmada Bachao Andolan, or Save the Narmada movement. She also was to later win the Right Livelihood Award, or the Alternative Nobel Prize, as it is called. I was a journalist then, and little did I know that I was witnessing the birth pangs of a social movement that would go on to transform the very development project in India in fundamental ways. But listening to Medha, I realized what now seems so obvious, the intertwined and symbiotic relationship that binds environmental protection, social justice, and the development project. That insight, coupled with a sense of watching democracy at work, profoundly shaped my thinking. Although I didn't realize it at that time, I was hooked on the idea of sustainability. Indeed, as I reflect on my research over the last 20 to 25 years, it seems clear that the enduring element in all the twists and turns my life and work have taken is a concern for the multifaceted concept of sustainability. Now, it's true that sustainability is a term that is so widely used, so endlessly used, in fact, that many have dismissed it as an empty buzzword. What's worse is that the term has been systematically marginalized, undermined, and even colonized, really, by the powerful consumerist right-wing business and political lobby groups. It's time we reclaimed it. There is no other term, I believe, that has the power to capture the multiple dimensions of environmental protection, social justice, cultural diversity, politics, and good governance as sustainability does. Each of these dimensions, refracted through the prism of feminist politics, has been a central focus of my work. So in the talk that follows, I share some of my stories of research on the struggles over the meanings of nature, development, and science, stories that are at heart about sustainability, diversity, and social justice. Let me go back in time to the small town in central India where I spent my early childhood. Bhilai was a microcosm of India, and growing up there was an early lesson of the seeming possibilities for the happy coexistence of diverse cultures, faiths, and practices. An identity constructed around race or marginality was not in my vocabulary while growing up. We were all Indians. Unity in diversity was a slogan we all grew up with. In the 1960s and 70s in India, there was a sense of a shared national project of creating a new, independent India where religion, caste, and regional identity was secondary to a common struggle to build a prosperous country. This myth, which many of my generation cherished, has in many ways imploded in recent years, especially in the face of the oppression faced by the Adivasi peoples, as well as the reality today of a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist government which has set about systematically undermining the syncretic pluralism of India through attacks on minority communities and the rewriting of history. But the patterns of religious fundamentalism, neoliberal economic exploitation, and resource wars that are currently taking place in India are part of the larger global discourses of colonization and neo-colonialism that I take a critical look at. I'll fast forward through to the mid-1980s when I joined the Times of India as a journalist in Mumbai. I did what junior reporters do, covering the city beats, writing stories that I was assigned to, and working very long hours. But I also started to slip away on weekends to write about issues that were starting to matter to me, around struggles over water and destructive large dams, and meanings of development in rural India. In fact, it was on one of those off-the-beat news rounds that I encountered the protest movement against the World Bank-funded Narmada Dam project that I mentioned earlier. A couple of years into my journalistic career came a series of serendipitous events that changed the direction of my life in profound ways. I was given an opportunity to go on a 6-month visit to a newspaper in New York City, to Manhattan, and then, through another series of happy developments, at the end of that period, I was given a scholarship, or an assistantship really, to graduate studies in political science in Purdue University in the US. I decided to take the chance and stay. It was a leap of faith with only my journalistic curiosity to keep me company. I didn't have much of an idea about life in the US, and even less so of the world of academia. I soon got the hang of the strange world of supersized burgers and a million choices of the kinds of breads to order for a sandwich, traffic that flowed in seemingly opposite directions, and lights that came on when you switched them off and turned off when you switched them on. But what took a bit of time to understand was that my identity itself was undergoing a transformation. I couldn't take things for granted anymore. I was no longer a person like anyone else, or so I thought. I was a third worlder. I was no longer just a woman, I was a woman of color. At this time of internal and intellectual ferment, I soaked in the works of Black women writers, the novels of Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker, the poems of Maya Angelou, June Jordan, and Audre Lorde, and the essays of Patricia Williams, Angela Davis, and Bell Hooks. Gender, ethnicity, race, and class were not merely intersecting structural realities, but worked with and against each other. I realized that how we understand and act on our desires for equity, justice, fairness, truth, and beauty is inevitably shaped by our experiences of the structural and emotional realities of the societies we live in. This realization served as a feminist passport for me to travel across time, place, and disciplines. This passport took me not only from India to the US and eventually to Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also allowed me to explore how power plays out in a variety of contexts around issues of the environment, development, and sustainability. Over the last 2 decades, or 2.5 decades really, 3 central issues have underpinned my academic work. The centrality of gender in environmental sustainability, the complex implications of culture and difference for social sustainability, the democratic governance of science and sustainable citizenship. One of the most exciting things that happened to me when I embarked on doctoral studies was the extraordinary privilege of being able to work with Robert V. Bartlett, a preeminent scholar of environmental politics who did pioneering work on ideas of ecological rationality, environmental impact assessment, and deliberative democracy, and Lynn Kathleen, whose work on feminist politics and policy analysis was deeply influential. Suddenly, I could begin to theorize the citizens' movement against the Narmada Dam, for example, that I had been reporting on in India. So began my doctoral journey and the genesis of my first book and a research agenda on gender and environmental sustainability. The movement against the Narmada Dam spanned the local, regional, national, and international realms in terms of its spatial reach. It brought together Adivasis, farmers, and environmental and human rights activists. It was led by a charismatic, articulate woman, Medha Patkar, whom I had met back in 1988. And it was remarkably successful in not only capturing the attention of the international media and international non-governmental organizations, but also in being the very first to have forced the World Bank to withdraw from funding a large-scale dam project ever. The conflict in the Narmada Valley was over the waters of the river and the forests and the lands in the submergence areas of the dam, where the Adivasis saw nature not just materially as a source of their survival, and more fundamentally as pivotal to their identity as a people. And this, in fact, is something that closely parallels Maori understandings of whakapapa and links with nature. The state and rich farmers and industrialists saw the water as a resource, the forests as something that they could replant somewhere else, and the displaced people themselves as dispensable in the larger cause of national development. For their efforts, those who opposed the dam were castigated as being anti-national and anti-development. So my book, Engendering the Environment, Gender in the World Bank's Environmental Policies, offered a particular kind of intervention. Rather than take the path already taken brilliantly by anthropologists, sociologists, and economists, I examined instead the gendered nature of policies that could, in the name of the holy grail of development, destroy people's homes, lives, cultures, and lands. Such destruction and violence was also layered and interwoven around issues of class, race, and gender. Tribal women, poor women, and single women, for example, were the worst off. I argued in the book that it wasn't just that development policies, environmental policies, and social policies deliberately disadvantaged many categories of women, but that they were imbued with what I described as masculine values. And so when I say masculine values, I'm not referring to men as such. Rather, I'm pointing to the dominance of certain kinds of values, certain kinds of knowledges, and certain ways of being that historically have been identified with the privileged position of dominant men in society. In contrast, indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of the soft social sciences, a focus on culture, lived experience, and relationships are all deemed feminine by Western society. Such a distinction is important for two reasons. Masculinity and femininity are not two equal categories. One is privileged more than the other. Second, the power implications of this also has an impact on access to resources, on who has legitimacy and whose voices are heard. A significant focus of this book and a number of articles that preceded it was a critical analysis of this thing called environmental impact assessment, or EIA. Now, EIA is hailed as one of the most transformative policy innovations of the 20th century. So I undertook the first ever feminist gender analysis of EIA to show how EIA theories, processes, and practices were inherently masculine in the knowledges and the values that they endorsed. I specifically looked at how the World Bank's EIA policies were implemented in the Third World. And so around the same time as my book, I co-authored with Robert Bartlett an article on the implicit theoretical models of EIA, which has become a touchstone for all writing on EIA ever since. So my project, in essence, exemplified the fundamentally complex nature of sustainability. It demonstrated that there is no pure environment or nature out there. Environmental protection and sound economic development can only happen when social justice is centered. As the environmental justice movement has pointed out often in the past, there can be no nature without justice and no justice without nature. But equally importantly, nature-culture relations and the sustainability project are fundamentally gendered. As I argued then, and I continue to think that this in fact holds true, the dominance of masculinist values in environmental and social policy jeopardizes the goal of sustainability. There were other difficult questions that I was left with after writing this book. How do we imagine and reimagine the shape of sustainable development that takes account of power, difference, culture, and agency? Addressing this question has driven my subsequent research projects. Questions around third world development, agency, culture, and women led to an exciting collaboration with Professors Kumkum Bhavnani and John Foran of the University of California, Santa Barbara, which led to the publication in 2003 of a hugely successful book, really, entitled Feminist Futures, Reimagining Women, Culture, and Development. And in 2009, a volume called On the Edges of Development, Cultural Interventions. Feminist Futures laid the foundation for a Women, Culture, and Development, or WCD as the acronym is, paradigm, which has received significant traction. And this paradigm provided an exciting creative space to explore with other scholars and activists how culture is interwoven with social practices. And the second edition of this book is forthcoming next year. The challenge of destructive development that informed Feminist Futures also catalyzed our next book, On the Edges of Development. The worst impacts of the environmental and social upheaval in the wake of resource exploitation is felt by the most economically and socially marginalized segments of society everywhere. The Adivasis in India, the Ogoni in Nigeria, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the remote communities of Papua New Guinea, for example. On the Edges of Development shows how development is about access to resources for survival and well-being, and it's a struggle that is at once cultural, political, and ideological. Working on the Edges book also brought home to me that the core and periphery was not a straightforward binary. There is a dominant core with power within the peripheries, and there is a marginalized periphery within the core. So, for example, the so-called developed nations have huge pockets of the poor and the underprivileged, and the incarceration of black communities disproportionate to their share of the population, whether it's in the United States or of Aboriginal communities in Australia, are just some obvious examples of this. And similarly, pockets of often corrupt, wealthy elites rule the roost in otherwise impoverished countries. So the politics of borders and the imperatives of social sustainability was something that engaged me when I came to New Zealand. So I spent a year at the University of California, Santa Barbara as a dissertation scholar, and then finished my PhD at Purdue University, at which point I was offered this job at the University of Waikato in 1996. 1996 was an election year in New Zealand. It was also just 9 years after New Zealand had liberalized its white New Zealand policies, immigration policy. So immigration since 1987 was on the basis of skills, and the early 1990s had seen the numbers of that rather broad category called Asian immigrants increase. By March 1996, newspaper headlines were screaming about a yellow peril and an Asian invasion, often quoting the leader of a small populist party that I don't need to name. It became commonplace to have people talk disparagingly about Asian drivers or rich Asians inflating house prices. Now, does that sound familiar by any chance? And so on. The racist abuse that I would face almost daily as I walked from home to the university was greeted with both a sense of surprise that it should happen and almost an instinctive denial. It just seemed so alien to the New Zealand way of life. But in a small country like New Zealand, transcending the barriers of nation, race, and class can too often seem insurmountable. As research in New Zealand continues to show, having Asian or non-Anglo names can be a significant deterrent in getting a job. But even with a continuing appointment in hand, I had to jump a few hoops in the process of gaining residency here. I first had to prove to New Zealand Immigration Services that I could speak English in order to qualify for permanent residency. So I tried to reason with the immigration official that the University of Waikato wouldn't have hired me to teach if I couldn't speak English. But hey, this wasn't about logic, was it? So I produced my BA degree in English literature from the University of Madras. But that wasn't good enough for the immigration official. It did not state on the degree certificate that the medium of instruction was in English. And so I said, right, that's okay, I can deal with this. But my MA and PhD certificates were from Purdue and a top-ranked US university. And so I produced those. But that would not do too. I finally got my rather bemused head of department from Purdue to write a letter to Immigration Services saying that the medium of instruction at Purdue is English. So simultaneously, my partner and I found that we were regularly complimented on our excellent English. Perfectly ordinary conversations would get interrupted by, "Oh, you speak such good English!" exclamations. So when we probed gently, it would soon emerge that the interrupter, and there were many really well-meaning people, often people that you encounter in the process of going to the bank or somebody you meet on the streets, but that they assumed that because we looked different, indeed looked foreign, we could hardly be expected to be fluent in English. So these experiences of anti-Asian rhetoric, well-meaning condescension, and the lack of diversity in the workplace triggered an interest in learning more about the history of immigration in New Zealand, as well as learning about the Treaty of Waitangi, biculturalism, and the history of colonization in New Zealand. The politics of biculturalism in New Zealand is such that there is almost an exclusive focus on Maori-Pākehā relations. Despite the presence of Indians and Chinese in New Zealand from the mid to the late 18th century, until quite recently, there's been little academic acknowledgement of their presence or contribution to the social, economic, and political fabric of the country. And I should point here to the doctoral work by one of my PhD students, Dr. Todd Nakowitz, that offers documented historical evidence of the presence of Indians in Aotearoa from 1769. Having acquired an Indian or minority identity marked by my brown body during my years in the US, I found myself in New Zealand lumped into this amorphous category called Asian, a category that was deemed to be somehow the other. I could also perceive a shaky sense of national identity that was reflected in an oft-stated desire to identify New Zealand with the First World and to distinguish it from the Third World. So in a research project, Debashish Munshi and I showed that there is what we call a discursive phobia of the Third World in New Zealand. Despite a well-deserved reputation for being a largely tolerant society in the face of rapid social and cultural diversification in the last 3 decades, questions about what it is to be a New Zealander and who is a New Zealander continue to be debated. The valorizing of whiteness as a subtext of national identity is something that has been evident in media and political discourse, whether it is in Paul Henry's questioning of Anand Satyanand's fitness to be the Governor-General, or the resistance by the state to increase the refugee quota in sort of recent times. Our analysis of the ways in which the Third World is deployed in New Zealand shows how widely accepted across the political spectrum is the construction of the Third World as inferior and negative. And I want to acknowledge the work on this project by Rebecca Fraser, who participated in the larger project that we were in. So if you were to take a look at just a few examples of the hundreds that we found in our sample, I have some of those quotes up there. The elements of race, ethnicity, and difference hidden under the layer of the term Third World thus come through in studies on discourses around immigration, which have lines separating us and them. Around the same time as immigration was a hot topic in New Zealand, there was another contentious issue polarizing society: genetic modification, which became also the research focus of one of my then master's students, Jeanette Wright. Debashish Munshi and I decided to explore if there was anything in common between the issues of immigration and genetic modification. On the face of it, there were 2 very different issues, but we wanted to delve deeper and study the discourses of genetic modification and immigration. It turned out to be a bigger project. Interestingly, we found that both of these discourses shared common anxieties about the protection and breaching of a range of boundaries, particularly national, cultural, political, and genetic ones. Diversity was at the heart of them both. Policy changes taking place in the early 2000s aimed at tightening immigration criteria, making them more restrictive, and loosening procedures for genetic modification by lifting the moratorium on the release of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. In essence, both these policy moves were about reducing diversity. In immigration, the intent was to reduce ethnic diversity. And in GM, it was about reducing biodiversity through the creation of monocultures. What was particularly intriguing about the policy moves on the two issues was that policymakers appeared to be moving towards the rigid boundaries option in the case of immigration, but was more inclined towards the flexible boundaries option in the case of GM. And so this got us thinking more deeply about the complex intersections between the social and the scientific, and subsequently led us to a major project on sustainable citizenship. What we saw in the case of GM was that despite tremendous societal opposition to it, policymaking processes appeared inadequate to respond appropriately to the challenges of this technology. What then of technologies such as nanotechnology, which are still so new that there is little public awareness about them? The absence of adequate information in the public domain about these new technologies has triggered utopic and dystopic narratives, which raise more questions than answers. If these technologies hold sway, what would it mean to be human? Who would have access to these technologies, and with what consequences? For us, these questions also demonstrate that new technologies emerging on the scientific frontier pose a fundamental challenge to planetary sustainability and require rethinking the meaning of citizenship. It is in this quest that Debashish and I immersed ourselves in an interdisciplinary project on sustainable citizenship that focuses on theorizing the intersections of sustainability and citizenship in the context of decision-making on new technologies. Part of the impetus for this research came from the fact that current scholarship on citizenship has not really grappled with the multifaceted challenges of sustainability. And so this is a website that was set up for our project and which has all of the research that's come out, the presentations, the papers, the team, etc. So our project, funded by a Marston grant, moved away from treating views on new technologies in oppositional terms. It's not really very productive to think of it in terms of good and evil. Rather, we wanted to see how we can foster public engagement and better decision-making through a clash of ideas rather than through routine dialogues. So one of the reasons why new technologies have sparked conflict is because policymakers and politicians have historically chosen to defer to the power of scientific rationality expressed by the technical elite in making decisions. In other words, policies are framed that affect the many, but are informed by a few. As a result, many groups of citizens and the diversity they bring with them have been simply absent in any kind of democratic decision-making. So the key questions for us were, how can we incorporate public engagement in formulating public policies on new technologies? How do we find common ground among the polarities that are there? We figured that we had to go beyond just routine dialogues that are often favored by policymakers. Dialogues have their uses, but they do not always adequately address power imbalances amongst diverse publics. So we drew on two very different methodological approaches, Q-sort surveys and deliberative citizen panels to locate shared values through a clash of ideas. In the first part, for the Q-sort, we pulled together a list of statements that reflected diverse range of views on new technologies. We then got people representing different beliefs to think through and deliberate on these statements and then prioritize them. And through this process of doing the Q-sort survey, we found that underneath the differences was a significant common ground that people were willing to work on. In the second part, we used citizen panels for deliberations on issues of new technology. We wanted to see, with regard to nanotechnologies in the New Zealand context, whether and in what ways traditionally marginalized groups, such as Maori and young adults, would respond. What we learned from these panelists was fascinating. One story in particular struck us as deeply insightful. When the Maori panel discussed nanotechnology, they pondered what it might mean to have their traditional wood carvings done on materials strengthened by nanotechnology. It could mean that sacred carvings could have a significantly extended life, which was an exciting possibility. But then, as they deliberated more, they reflected on what it might mean to have carvings that last a long time, maybe forever. Would the younger generation want to, or even need to, learn the traditional skills of carving if carvings never deteriorated? What would happen to culture and traditions when technological innovation undermined the passing on of intergenerational knowledge? In the case of the youth panel, made up of young adults between the ages of 18 and 24, we found that many of the participants were amazed by the fact that we even wanted to hear their views. What mattered to them was not so much the pros and cons of new technologies, but what they called the real issues of employment and survival. And they had divergent views among them too. Who decides on which technologies should be used? For whose benefit? Young people want to say in shaping the world they are to inherit, but their input is rarely acknowledged. So what our project showed is that sustainable citizenship is about collective action for an inclusive society. It's less about establishing a consensus on an easily applicable framework than it is about acknowledging divergent perspectives and engaging with them productively. Collective action becomes possible through allowing a clash of ideas amongst widely divergent perspectives. So our work on the Sustainable Citizenship Project has been widely published in a number of leading journals. And in June this year, Debashish and I were invited to do a TEDx talk on this topic, which was a little nerve-wracking, but a great deal of fun. And in that talk, we covered some of the highlights of our projects that I just discussed. The recognition of the fundamentally intertwined nature of environmental sustainability, social justice, and cultural context, which has been at the heart of my previous work, is also at the center of my current project on climate justice with my research collaborators Debashish Munshi, Kumkum Bhavnani, and John Foran. Funded by a Rockefeller Foundation grant, our project is a recognition that the crisis of climate change, which threatens the lives and livelihoods of vulnerable peoples around the world, needs radically new social, political, and cultural interventions. We began the project with a 3-day symposium on climate futures in Bellagio, Italy, in July 2015, bringing prominent public intellectuals, scientists, and interdisciplinary scholars together with policymakers from governments and grassroots climate activists from every continent to search for fresh ideas for realizing better climate futures. That symposium provided a dynamic interface for people working on different aspects of climate change. Second, it also created a space to develop new approaches that highlight the need for centering climate justice in the global climate negotiations of 2015 and its aftermath. This work leads into a book project on climate justice that we are currently working on. Today marks a significant milestone in my academic journey. And as I said at the start, this is a journey that I've not taken alone. I've had the privilege of working not only with some amazing research collaborators around the world and in New Zealand, but also with many extraordinary PhD, master's, and undergraduate students. Some of these students are now top-notch academics, themselves scattered around New Zealand or the globe. Some others have gone on to become policy analysts, community workers, parents, and above all, good citizens of the world. Many of them have been involved in research projects with me over the years, and these have often been incredibly exciting, exhilarating learning experiences for me. So I'd like to acknowledge, in particular, Rachel Saman Kumar, Veritza Rupa, Raven Emmett, Hume Johnson, Jeanette Wright, Todd Nakowitz, Gauri Nandedkar, Sangyeon Tew, Graham McKenzie, Nyamama Avirmed, Rebecca Bollard, Megan Smith, and Amy Nines, some of whom are here today. And there are many, many other students who have touched my life in profound ways. I also want to acknowledge Shema Hamilton Ethnic Women's Center Trust, an organization that I helped set up about 14 years ago and which I'm honored to be a part of. In many ways, Shema represents the hopes and aspirations of ethnic women in the Waikato and the coming together of commitments to social justice, diversity, and inclusiveness, in essence, sustainability, that ultimately is what all of my work has been about. I want to end with the words of June Jordan as we contemplate how we enact sustainability in our life work. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Priya. Te Bashish and family, tēnā koutou. Everyone, thank you very much for attending tonight to hear Priya's extraordinary journey, both personal and intellectual. The two are wrapped up so beautifully, I think, in the way you've presented this talk. From your time as a young journalist in India, still as a journalist in the US, and then slipping into academia, and through that route coming to New Zealand. And over that whole journey, their environment has mattered. Social justice as well, and wrapped up into development studies and sustainability. All, as you say, viewed from a certain point through the feminist prism, and taking on board the centrality of gender in economics, policy development, development studies, the gendered nature of that policy. But also, as you came to New Zealand, it opened your eyes to the issues of migration. And I can't resist saying that those of us who actually migrated here from England, and by definition spoke English, still could not be understood. New Zealand's a curious place for that. Overall, I think that wraps up into the idea of national identity, which of course, as today, is part of the debate about the flag and what does that mean and what goes into it through the referendum. But also the way your trajectory has gone, as you described it, through to sustainable citizenship, climate change and citizenship. And while you describe that as a trajectory, I still see it coming back in full circle to where you started, with the whole issue of your place as an individual within the environment and within society as such. And while there's been an element of serendipity in what's happened to you, how you ended up, for instance, in the US, how you ended up here, there is, I think, still that strong thread through there of the intellectual development that has drawn you through down that path. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in thanking Priya for what's been a fascinating talk tonight. This concludes the formal part of the evening. The discussion can continue afterwards, and Priya will be available afterwards, I'm sure, to take questions. The bar will be open. But again, can I thank you for attending tonight, and look forward to seeing you again at future inaugurals. Thank you.